I thought it would be good to talk to folks who both observed and directly participated in the effort to organize and make the case, how you do it. And, I want to start with Warren, and I have to give great credit to Warren and J Ideas for having really spent a lot of time and attention in the last couple years on what's happening around the country, both in terms of, reporting it and also in helping educate others about what's happening and how they can do it too. And Warren, I'd like to begin with you and just tell me what you've learned about this process and specifically organizing a successful effort. What do you think it takes to make that happen? So.
Well, I think it takes involvement at a lot of levels. I first learned of the effort going on in Washington when some of us were at a conference in Chicago that we organized for McCormick about digital free speech, and saw a column by the Seattle Times writer who kind of shined a light on this whole thing that was going on with Up the Grove, and I said, this is something we need to get involved with. And we were encouraged at that point by Knight, which has been our funder until July, to get involved in the public policy framework. Unfortunately, as time went on, that backing from Knight kind of blinked on and off because we were, at J Ideas, we were walking a fine line between advocacy and information. That was the number one thing we did, was provide information for people on all this. But I got a couple of phone calls from Eric Newton saying, ooh, you're kind of glowing over into the advocacy line here. You're getting better watch it. And I think it's because lawyers in Miami were telling him that. But it was very much a key part of our program was to deal with public policy. And we looked at that, our role, as one where we had, because of my background in professional media, a unique opportunity to try to connect the professional, the college, and the scholastic side together behind this. And we wrote more stories on our website about this whole thing, to the point where there's Ellen Smith, who was Dave Up the Grove's assistant?
No, Rachel.
Rachel Smith, where we got the word from Up the Grove is back off a little bit. I'm trying to do some behind-the-scenes work here, and ironically, our ability to shine the sunshine on this might have hurt at times. But that's, I believe in more sunshine rather than less. So, but some of the learnings, do you want me to keep going here? Is first of all, this whole thing is really about civics. And I think that's the strongest argument that anybody can be making in a state effort. Civics. It's not about, I have a chance to write what I want, and that's what sometimes you get from kids. But what this does is provide the opportunity for students to learn responsibility and accountability. And I'm taking a page from the book of Randy Schweikel, our colleague and good friend here, is, do you want kids to learn responsibility and accountability, or compliancy and obedience? And I think that's a strong argument you can make in any state. This is a means of letting kids learn how to be responsible journalists and citizens. One of the things, and I've had conversations with a number of you about this, is I'm disappointed that we haven't been more successful with professional media. And I've talked to key editors at AS&E, I'm an AS&E member, and I get their eyes are glazing over. They just don't see the connection between their harried business right now and their struggle for survival with kids having the ability to express more press freedoms. Somehow, and Diana, I know you and I have had this, we've got to get through to the education chairs. Ken Paulson of USA Today is a strong advocate, but he's so busy. But I talked with Dave Boardman at the Seattle Times, not high on his radar. It's just not high on his radar. And he is not the problem at the Seattle Times, it's the editorial board. And I think we have to understand the difference between the people who direct news coverage and the people who direct opinion whenever we take those on. Go ahead.
Just out of curiosity, and Brian alluded to it a little earlier in his remarks today, where do they think that they're going to get reporters in a year or two? I mean, Everyone wants to go to different types of media. They want to blog for Huffington. They want to go into PR. They want to go everywhere but newspapers. Where do they think the kids are coming from then?
Is that?
As much as as much as any individual in this room, AS&E member or staff person, can't speak on behalf of hundreds of individual members, I will say that I think on the part of some, while there is a sympathy and an understanding of what this means, they are uncomfortable personally being advocates. They are news people, they are news gatherers, and they are not going to be comfortable going into the role and being an advocate. And I don't think their eyes are glazing over. They are saying, there are things where I can make some immediate difference. There are others where in my role, in what I do, I can't do this, or it makes me uncomfortable doing it.
You know, and not to interrupt you, Warren, but I do think what they can do is open doors to the editorial boards.
And some have.
And some have. You're right.
Successfully
You're
and
right.
some not.
Yeah. Quickly, Tori, and then
I'm
you.
sorry, one more quick comment about this, just having worked at the Associated Press for 10 years and working with members all over the country, newspaper members. There was a sort of a consensus inside New York on many occasions that, you know, news people think 24-hour blocks. It's often very difficult to change that mindset to a very long-term process of passing legislation. And so I think that just from that standpoint, you'd think publishers are thinking more long-term like that. And of course, with today's climate right now, they just want to survive today. But before the crisis, the economic crisis, it's one of those things to try to get them to focus. We, for years, tried to get them to focus on technology, moving to the digital darkroom. We got nothing but hell for 10 years from members. Finally, everybody moves. They didn't like having moved, they had complaints, whatever, but it was this very long process. So.
Jim brings up a good point, and I link it back to what the senator had to say is people are going to be modeling whether we're caring about this or not over time. And we see that, I think all of us who, most of you guys were around, this is really before my time in student journalism, is the fear was when Hazelwood was enacted that people would start to self-censor, and we know that that has happened now. And that took 20 years or less, depending on how you want to argue it, but there's too much self-censorship going on already. But I also learned in our effort, we were purely behind the efforts in Washington and Oregon both, is that not only is it difficult to get this on the radar of the professional journalists, that it's difficult to get it on the radar of legislators. They look at this and say, well, we're trying to build a new stadium here in Seattle, or we've got this public works project. Why are we worrying about students? That it just doesn't elevate high enough. And that becomes a real challenge for all of us in this room, is how do we say this is as important as this initiative in this state or whatever. And sometimes that means, and I guess last year, is you back off for a year when it doesn't look like it's going to be high enough on the radar. And I took a lot away from some of the conversation earlier about courting the right people. I know in some efforts that I've observed and been involved with peripherally is that the right people haven't been involved, and the idea of courting the opposition. As far as reaching the professional press, maybe another effort ought to be made to try to reach the bloggers and the citizen journalists around there who create such a buzz on both the liberal and conservative side. That might be something to go on. But I would like to chat a little bit about how open should this effort be, and when do you need to close it down? And I felt some pressure from you guys, and I know why you were doing it. But we were trying to publicize on a daily basis what was going on, and when Up the Grove came back and said, well, let's let it go for a while and keep it quiet. And that's the question also, is when do you go under the radar and when are you above the radar? And that's my thoughts.
That's really important, and we've heard that argument before too. Brian and Kathy, you have, the funny thing is that I always cite Washington as the example, despite the fact that you don't have a state law, of such a great organization, a powerful voice in your legislative sponsor, a great organization of both groups and individuals who are really committed to it, and I feel optimistic that it will happen. I'm curious, from your perspective, how did you do it, and what did you do for the benefit of everybody who doesn't know? How did you make it happen? So, and I'll let you guys decide who wants to go first. So.
Kathy's got the cheat sheet over here.
Okay, yeah.
Well, I will say that after hearing from different people today, I realized that a lot of other states were much more organized than we were. In fact, the first year, we were pretty clueless. We really learned by the seat of our pants, but thank goodness for a representative up the Grove, because he really did help educate us on how things worked in the legislature. And I mean, we really learned as we were going along much of the time. And then I also have to say that without J Ideas and their persistence in keeping everything up to date, we were able to refer our members to their site all the time. I don't know how many people I referred to their site. And then on top of that, Angela Thomas, who was at that time working for J Ideas and isn't with them now, came out to be in Washington State for our hearing and was just such a cheerleader and also really incredibly knowledgeable and very articulate. So she really helped us get through that first year. And I mean, we came pretty close, I think. We just had a roadblock when we hit that Senate committee. But after that first year was when Up the Grove, Representative Up the Grove said, we really need to try to form a coalition. So he came to our spring, early summer retreat for WJEA, and we sat down and we kind of brainstormed about what groups should we contact, who should be in this coalition, what should we do. We just spent a part of the afternoon just going through and trying to figure out who to reach out to. And after that meeting, then I began to kind of try to pull it together. And fortunately, I have a really understanding boss at the Washington News Council because, and I'm only funded 3 days a week. So I was doing the other, this other stuff. But also realizing that WJEA is a 501c3 corporation, I had to be also really careful about the advocacy piece. So I thought, gee, maybe Brian would like to be the head of the coalition. So I asked Brian if he would take over as a coordinator, and he did, and immediately got a press release out, and we put together the statement, which is in your notebook, the mission statement that took a lot of tweaking. I remember having it, we sent it back to Ball State, and they had us tweak some of the language, before they were really comfortable having their logo on it. There are other logos down below that we, really had. ACLU, for example, was very sensitive about, okay, we will sign on to this statement and this statement only, but if you change anything in the statement, we want to know about it first because, we have to have board approval to be on this statement, and no alterations unless we hear about it. So
If I can mention at
Yeah.
that point, when this was happening, I was in dialogue with Eric Newton at Knight. Knight told us they were afraid that our open advocacy of some of this might affect their status as a multi-million-dollar 501c3.
Let me know I'm in our next session. I want to talk about that whole issue a little bit because I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about that. But in any event, that's a good point.
well, and there are just so many things I'm still learning about this. We could keep trying to reintroduce it for the next 5 years, and I'd probably learn something new every single time. But I think that's we need to be able to answer those questions. So I need just learning about the law, and having the SPLC as a resource has just been invaluable also. So we went forward the second year with this group in place, but now I'm realizing that we didn't engage our coalition as strongly as we should have, and I think part of the problem with that was just our own time and lack of resources because we have no funding. And Brian was driving across the state from Washington State University to attend meetings and trying to be a student. And I mean, it is just, it's very challenging to try to pull something like this off. And I do know now that there are some of these, especially on the local level, some of these logos that you see on this page that should be way more involved the next time around. And I think we'll target some of them to become more involved. And if they have lobbyists, try to get their lobbyists more involved. And again, it's just been such a learning process. But I agree that we probably will pass this dang thing one of these years. If we can hang in there, all this learning will have been worth it. So.
Is Up the Grove's enthusiasm still at a high level?
Well, it was pretty high before the Puyallup School District issue came up, but we now have this huge public relations disaster going on with a lawsuit in the Puyallup School District in Washington that, well, all I can say is, as a piece of advice, if you're planning to pass legislation, please tell the students in your state to hold off on the oral sex story until in the months prior to introducing legislation. So, that was, yeah, we did that too, so, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, there was.
There was a high
Well,
school.
let me, one thing to clarify before we get to Brian here, Kathy, explain to me again, to all of us, the organization structure. Brian, at that last year, was sort of the coordinator of this effort. And then amongst this coalition, did you have periodic meetings? I mean, what was sort of the structure of the way the group worked?
Well, maybe I'll let Brian talk to that.
That's good, yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that became pretty clear this last year, I think it was pretty clear early on in the session that the bill wasn't really going to go anywhere. And so, it seemed rather pointless to try and get all these people engaged in something that was going to, I think, probably not have a huge benefit. In hindsight, I think what we could certainly have done better was, get all these people in a room and, hash out some of these things beforehand. But I do think that this mission statement was a really effective, or at least would have been if we had gotten a hearing persuasion tool, in the sense that it is very simple. It's one page, and it has these logos, so you can see on one page very clearly, where we're coming from on this.
Legislators like pictures too. Yeah.
Right, yeah. And Dave at one point said to me, you can come up with all the great materials you want, and you can put on a committee member, a stack of papers this high, and they will leave it there. All they want something simple. And frankly, as we got more into the process, we at one point got a hold of some opposition talking points, and you can see that's kind of what they're going off of. Because they didn't really want to take the time to learn about the bill. They were going off of these sort of caucus talking points that they had received. One thing that I did want to point out that I think was particularly helpful in our case was that our sponsor, I think, I don't have a huge amount of experience, but I think something that was a little bit unusual is he was very open with us about strategy, to the point where I was emailing and talking with him back and forth when he was on the floor and when they were doing votes. And that kind of thing. So we were fortunate to be very involved in the sort of internal political workings, and it was almost like a lobbying training experience for me in some ways. But I thought that was very helpful, that we weren't just kind of standing on the outside waiting to find out what was going to happen. We could anticipate in advance because we were part of the conversation. And then the one other thing that I had was, we talked a little bit about involving colleges and how the college piece plays into this. And I guess my personal opinion is, if you can keep them in there, I think that's a plus, because, having this sort of big tent coalition of people, as the senator talked about before, the more people you have, involved is certainly a plus. That said, I think from their perspective, they would probably just assume we just, cut the high school part out, because we pretty well know that we could pass the college part of the bill, and that would not be a problem at all. So from their standpoint, they're coming back to the legislature every year fighting for this thing when the real issue has nothing to do with them, frankly. And so, I'm sympathetic in understanding where they're coming from, and, why can't we just, cut the high school part out, pass the college part, and then come back later and do it again. I think you run the risk, though, of having that end up be seen as the compromise. We worked on this, and the compromise was we passed the college part and didn't deal with the high school part, and that's the end of the story. So again, I guess my takeaway point would be, if you can keep people in the coalition, as many people as you can, that's a plus.
Warren, you mentioned the it's all about civics, and I'm curious, Kathy or Brian, what's your sense of? I mean, and your mission statement really sort of describes this, but if you in one sentence had to say what the argument is all about, or the argument that you think was the most resonant among those who you were trying to persuade, what would that be?
You mean in terms of our opponents?
Or potential supporters, people who hadn't made a decision. What argument do you think was most compelling to them, the most effective about why this bill is, important?
Well, I think one of them was the protection for school districts. I mean, it's becoming that's even more important to me now, and in terms of an argument, because we have a school district that's being sued right now for content in a student publication that when the content happened, the student publication was an open forum by practice and by policy. Was it by policy?
By both.
By both.
Yeah.
And it could protect the school district from liability. And in terms of our opponents, to me, that should be a really big deal. And in this case, we're talking millions of dollars that they might possibly save if they use this argument. But there are some complicating factors that I won't go into right now. But I think that protection piece, showing that a student publication that's an open forum is, making the students responsible for what they do, not only makes better journalism, but it also protects the school districts involved.
I would just say, and I've said this before, I really think there are kind of two approaches to arguing for this thing. One is the sort of the student rights angle, and the other is the educational benefit of doing this, that students learn better in this kind of an environment. And my sense was, and this probably isn't the case everywhere, but that despite all the stuff that I said earlier, the yay student rights approach didn't resonate very well with people. And I sort of got a chuckle when you were making the ACLU comment earlier, because I think that was one of the groups where it was like, that's not going to help us a whole lot on this particular issue. And I think, with the exception of some legislators who I think you would say were kind of on the left of the spectrum, who were probably going to vote for the bill anyway, the ACLU types weren't going to help us a whole lot. And so I think trying to bring home the argument that this is educationally sound, this is how students learn best, is probably a better argument, or at least it was, I think, in our case. Much as it pains me to say that student rights isn't a winner, but
questions of these guys about organization. I mean, one of the things I don't think any of us have really figured out yet, because I agree with what Jim Ewart said earlier, luck sometimes seems to play a bigger role in this than our own, great intentions. I don't think any of us have figured out what is the organizational secret to making this happen, or if we don't have the resources to organize in that way. But I'm curious, anybody has any insight or questions for these folks about specifically organizing? What is the right way to do it? Anybody have ideas, questions, thoughts? Yeah. Either, go ahead.
Well, go ahead, because I think I'm going to take us down a different path.
Well, quickly, I mean, in terms of allies that are maybe not the obvious allies, because we keep talking about press and journalism, one of the allies that I think is sort of potentially interesting, although carries some baggage with it, is the video gaming industry, for instance, has a huge interest in the protection of freedom of speech and the First Amendment, and underwrites a lot of First Amendment work at Penn State right now, is the leading funder of the First Amendment Center at Penn State right now, and obviously is very interested in a youth audience. Has there been any effort anywhere to bring in, the music industry, the video gaming industry, people who have a sort of a broader interest in freedom of speech like that?
I'm not aware of it. Senator Yee is good friends with the video gaming industry, I understand. So he may have some, insight into it. But anybody have any contact with them? No. The issue is that it's a great idea, actually, Frank. But what I fear is that this is distant enough from their direct interests that it's just not necessarily going to be seen as a priority. Interesting
If
idea.
you look at it, though, from the student perspective, all the night studies on First Amendment expression and buy-in suggest that students have a stronger support for the First Amendment when it touches on issues that are closer to home to them. And censorship is one of them, but music was the other that really stood out. If you get near my music, back off, boy. And so that may be a way of bringing more students into the fight.
Or we'll wrap them.
Put them on the after.
It's not me.
First Jim and then Logan.
I just had a quick question. Did you try to identify the specific reasons why members of the legislature opposed the bill? I mean, really try to isolate what it was that gave them such heartburn, and then maybe try to work from that?
Administrator phone calls. I mean, I really think that.
Well, not the
yeah.
process, the substantive issue that they had a problem with.
Oh, lack of oversight. The fear of lack of oversight on the school level. That unless the principal has the power to review and control content, all hell is going to break loose.
But you have that in here. You have the ability of the principal to do that in this bill.
I know, but again, the bullet points that Brian just talked about, the opposition bullet points, much easier for them to look at those than to, really read what the bill actually said.
And one thing I would reinforce what Kathy's saying, I've seen in several states where it had nothing to do with the substance of the bill because they didn't know what the bill said. They knew administrators in their district called them and said, you must oppose this bill, and they said yes. And that was the extent of their understanding of it. And that's a very difficult thing to respond to.
We dealt with that issue. I mean, we had the same issue that was raised on the first bill we did in 2005, the Hosty versus Carter bill. And we also had the same issue that was raised with this bill, that, administrators are not going to be able to control the content. And we pointed out that they have all kinds of leeway with the language. And you've adopted, or you would have adopted, much of the same language that we have in existing law right now. There's always going to be that tension between expression and the ability to exercise prior restraint. But this does give administrators plenty of opportunity to do that.
Well,
Yeah.
one thing it does suggest too is meeting with those legislators or their staff
Absolutely.
to force them to
Point it
explain why they're
Right.
opposing it. Yeah.
And
go ahead,
we,
Kathy.
that is something we would definitely do. And going into the second year, actually, when, we got shut down right away, the second year, but going into that year, we had the coalition and we reached out to the State Association of Principals. And we actually, Fern Valentine and I, drove down to Olympia and we had a meeting for over an hour with them. They were really softening up as we were going into the second year of this. The bill didn't get anywhere, but I don't think they would have been in as, they wouldn't have, it was sort of the kind of thing where we won't we won't be as vocally opposed to it this time. And I think we really have been kind of getting somewhere with them. But we weren't able to use that because it died right away the second year. So,
Logan, I put you off long enough. Your time.
Do we have time still?
Yeah, because we're
Okay.
full steam ahead.
Well,
so.
I had just a comment about what Frank was saying, then a new tangent, and that is the librarians in Washington State passed legislation last year. They were very successful. It was 3 librarians from Spokane, and they moved something in the legislature about funding for school libraries. And I think librarians are natural allies for the student press and freedom of expression. And I think you ought to talk to those 3 moms from Spokane, and 3 librarians. It's a great story I read in one of their library journal things. Yeah, natural allies, and a lot. I mean, and who doesn't like librarians, right? The other side, I guess, in the. I'm sorry.
Sarah Palin?
Wow. No comment. Just on the idea of organizing, and I think this is going to take us in a different direction, but everything we've talked about today has been remarkably old media. And we're talking about, I mean, this is the establishment. We talk about the press because this is the press. I mean, it doesn't at all acknowledge that there's a lot of groundswell of real influential opinion makers from the blogosphere and out there in cyberspace, and people who have a lot of ability to get attention of legislators and other agencies. But I also think Washington, and we talked briefly just before you went up to the panel, and several other states have that quirky initiative process as well, and that there could be a real groundswell. Has there been any thought, either in Washington or in other states, of kind of, no offense to the senator, but to bypassing the legislature that's not getting the results that you want, and instead going straight to the people?
That is a very California thing to do, you know.
It's much more expensive and much more labor intensive, and at the end, you're sort of like, let's hope it passes. But
You see that here in Ohio.
I don't know. I think, is there any?
Interesting alternative. They're not.
The problem I think with that is that if you see some of the, like the night studies and things that come out, I mean, the public, I mean, they're not especially supportive of this issue. I mean, it's something like, a third of them, think that agree with the position that we're taking. So I mean, it would require tons of education.
But don't you think it also requires a catchy name, like the death tax or something? All of a sudden, like, yes, I'm against that. So should you force principals to censor the paper? No, I don't think that should happen.
Right.
Even though we're talking about new media here, and I support that idea, Mark, you're probably the foremost authority on this, or perhaps Frank, is 2 states have laws on the books, Indiana being one of them, that is not a specific student press law, but it's part of the general statutes in Pennsylvania that provide a lot of what state legislation and elsewhere provides. I mean, should we be looking for other ways other than a law that comes before the legislature?
Well, let me just say my sense about the state regulations that exist out there about student free expression, and Washington is one of the states that has one. So Mike, maybe you can even talk about that more than I is. They don't really work very well in terms of administrators don't take them seriously at all, and there's no enforcement mechanism. I mean, Frank talked about the value of attorney's fees, and I would say clearly you want a civil remedy in a statute as well. These regulations don't have any of that. They basically say, here's what you're supposed to do, but the State Department of Education isn't bothering to enforce it, and there's nobody else really out there doing it. So, yeah, Carol.
Maybe what we have to do is everybody get their ammunition going, get ready to go. But Senator Yee said something very interesting. He said it happened at a certain time when this letter went out that said, aha, now we can go after all the papers. And that galvanized. And Kathy said, here we have a sex story going on now. That's just the word. I think you get yourself together, you get your organization, you get people really talking about it, and when the story comes, newspaper editors want the story. They want the anecdote.
Right.
They want to know it. And frankly, some of the subject matter of the stories that have come up for teacher protection are things that an editor would say, no, you don't use a kid's name in this point. I don't care if they're kids or not. You don't use a kid's
Right.
name here. Or other things like that. But you do find the perfect story. I mean, you do have Utica, the story in Michigan about the buses.
Right.
That's a clear story. It's just a newspaper story that would go in, and I think you had plenty of professional support with that one, right?
Well, in the case, perhaps, but not, as
Not in
Cheryl
the-
can
but
say,
not in the-
not for
now
the
you couldn't get it
legislature,
into the
yeah.
legislature.
Yeah,
But if you had something where you were set to go.
right.
And you spring the trap and you go with it on the story.
Well, you raise a really important point, Carol, and one of the things that I found in some of these state efforts is if you don't have compelling examples of the need for this, it's going to be very difficult to persuade them, and that almost has to be a precursor. And we all know the censorship's happening, but the problem is, can you actually quantify or describe anecdotally these particular incidents? And the SPLC does a great job of reporting many of the things that go on out there, but actually the state folks, the State Scholastic Press Associations probably know better than anybody what's actually happening in the schools in their state. Were you going to say something, Frank? Yeah.
Well, I was actually going to say this for the wrap-up, but this is the perfect entree to say it now, which is, I think one of the things that, we are limited as a journalism education community, in which I'll broadly include myself, in what we can do, but one of the things we absolutely can do as a journalism education community is to use our resources, and this is going to seem absolutely counterintuitive. It's going to seem like running directly into the teeth of a buzzsaw, but to encourage students to write real, serious, investigative journalism that holds schools accountable, and damn it, get it censored. Fine. Get it censored, because those are the horror stories that we need to bring to, I mean, as the senator said, as Jim said, it's the 14 teachers that lost their job that got that bill passed. If you get, as a taxpayer, right, as a member of the public, I think you do judo on this issue. You change the equities entirely. If a taxpayer says, you mean that principal ripped off that school and paid that coach $140,000 plus an expense account plus a free car, and they wouldn't let the kids put that in the newspaper. Now you have flipped the equities completely. Now you have a taxpayer and an angry member of the public that's on your side.
Between two, though, Frank, because I'm a practicing advisor right now, and you certainly pipe in on this, but I've got good kids. I'm in a good school with a good principal, and I'm in a good state with a good law, and I'm a pretty good advisor. And my kids don't go after the stories that'll get them in too much trouble. Like, they don't do them irresponsibly, A. But then B, they make really good choices about what to cover when and stuff like that in general. So I'm the perfect candidate for an advisor who could live through a fight. My kids aren't going to go looking for one because they don't have a need for. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right.
They don't have a need for it.
Your point is
Your
very-
point is
it's very
awesome.
well
Doing
taken,
good journalism.
but you can't look for it
Yeah.
any more than you can shy away.
Oh,
from
sure,
it.
Right.
sure. No, we can't manufacture situations,
Yeah.
but they will happen. They
But
will happen
but
organically.
my point is
They-
the turnover of advisors so quick. It really is. This job kills teachers. It kills teachers so fast. They say if you make it to 3, you'll either die or you'll be there for life. That's it. But and there are very few anymore who make it to 3. They're getting out as fast as they can. And the ones where the fights are going to come up, they're not in any place to take the fight.
Well, and that isn't that true of the actual Hazelwood situation? Wasn't it a new advisor?
It's a replacement.
The replacement.
So-
She was on maternity leave, right, or something
Yeah,
like
so-
that?
No, he went for a new
It al-
job.
it
Oh,
always-
okay.
It always seems to be a case, not always, but it
It's a new
often
job.
seems to be a case like that where, there's all this controversy and the person hasn't been there very long. Or you look at the stories and there was some irresponsibility. So, that would, the one that the sort of situation you described where you've got a strong program, you've got a great story, and for some reason they don't allow it to print, that would be textbook.
Yeah.
But I don't know how we could ever find that, because
Well,
in fact, the Jack Kennedys of the world, they can get their great
Well,
stories
and that's,
through, or,
no, but here's what's interesting. Jack Kennedy and Mark Newton, big proponents of awesome speech, have both made cases that made the SPLC, are in a district right now with a non-compliant policy to our state law. Jack Kennedy works for a district with a non-compliant policy. So does Mark Newton, and neither of those two would ever shy away from a fight. But right now, they're fighting the fight from within their own buildings, where they have a great They have a great relationship going with their principal, and in fact, when I recently notified them, them being the district, of their non-compliance with the state law, because like I said, we're really being aggressive in Colorado right now. When I officially notified them of their non-compliance, Jack's principal came and knocked on his door. Did you know that? Jack said, yeah, I knew that. And he said, do we have a problem here? And Jack said, we have a problem that the district policy is bad, but we wrote our policy to be good and you haven't asked. And he said, oh, okay. You should talk to the big guys. And Jack said, I will. And basically Mark Newton did the same thing. They both work in the same district. So I mean, there is no like publication nirvana out there. Two of our biggest names currently in scholastic journalism are in a bad district.
Well, Gloria Allman too.
Yeah, exactly. One thing this does suggest, though, if you're in a state where you'd like to have these protections, I mean, you at least already have them, Carrie, in Colorado, one of the things you can do is encourage more substantive, investigative, quality reporting by your student media, knowing that, of course, you know, we hope it doesn't get censored, but if it does, you're going to be setting yourselves up. And, you know, one of the things I'll mention, this is in the very early stages, but John Bowen is beginning a national effort that we're calling J-Wire to create and encourage investigative reporting by high school journalists, but in part because we see so little of it anymore, but also, I mean, a secondary benefit may be the opportunity it creates for, these kind of, defenses, yeah.
Well, I was going to say, just following the news in Washington, there have been so many different little hot spots up and down the Puget Sound area, from Everett to Puyallup and other areas, that it seems to me that that's a compelling case in itself, that there isn't a clear defined law, and so you have the disagreement about who's the publisher, and can we publish that just because we've been an open forum doesn't mean we are, or can we print the names of these students who apparently did these certain acts, or things like that. And that, it seems to me a case for Puyallup would be, if we had the law, it'd be clear the district would not be under fire, the students would be out there defending themselves, because that's what the law would be requiring. But the absence of a law is causing a lot more problems than a law would have clarified.
It's a great argument, yeah, you're right.
But that doesn't fit on a bumper sticker.
Well, no.
It's hard to put that in a bullet.
Yeah.
And I've always thought too that administrators should like this, because if they get a phone call, which they hate, at least in Michigan, all they'd have to say is, I'm sorry.
I have nothing to do with it.
Exactly.
My
And I
hands
would
are
think
tied.
that would make them happy.
The Constitution
They
of the
don't say
United
that.
States says I cannot tell them no.
What's
They
that?
don't know what Hazelwood means.
No.
They've misinterpreted it, and unless you have an advisor who understands the law themselves and what Hazelwood means, that can say, you are a fool if you don't let me be a forum, because let me just say, you'll hang if you miss it. And that part, I think, they don't understand that if they take on that role of prior review and restraint, that if it gets by, they will hang. If it's an open forum and it's there, they don't have liability.
They don't see their role, and the administrators I've spoken with, and maybe this is part of understanding and framing the issue, the administrators don't see their role as letting the advisor do their job. Many of them see their role as ensuring, ultimately, it's not even necessarily about control, but ensuring that everything that comes out from the school has had their influence or had their endorsement
Which
in
is
some
such
way.
a silly argument, because there are so many other specialty programs that don't have their endorsement
Yes, but
coming out of
I
the
understand
school.
that, but I'm just saying.
No, I know, but for them, it's a silly
I got
argument.
into a pretty good argument with some people who used to be my friends in Washington. And it's sad, really, because they're people I really respected, but they work for the Principals Association, and they just didn't get it. They didn't get where we were coming from on this issue, and they felt that really what should be happening, and I see where they're coming from, but I don't agree with it, that they felt that students and administrators should be able to come together and work out a resolution, sort of this philosophy of empowerment of students, and everyone gets along, and we all, at the end of the day, we all agree on things. The problem is, as people who've worked in newsrooms know, that's not the reality, and sometimes the principal is the subject of a story, too. And so I think that's where some of the principals and administrators are coming from, that they want to be able to continue to educate, but at the end of the day, they want to be the ones who have 51%
Well,
in that.
they feel it's their
equation.
responsibility, yeah.
Right.
John?
One
John
of
and
the-
then Mary.
One of the things that I have been working on this week is with an advisor in Missouri who's not had a prior review policy before, and her administrators have just decided that she's going to have one. And in the regulations the school board wrote, they wrote that the principal is now the editor. So they're simply wiping the student out of the process. And I don't understand how any administrator can logically defend that in terms of
Or how they
education.
can't be humiliated by saying,
Right.
I'm the editor of my high school newspaper, you know? Yeah.
Well, maybe
It's
they didn't get the
incredible.
job when they were in high school.
If they're the editor, they're
I don't understand.
But here, I'm gonna tell you a story from South Dakota, it's not about snow. We have not had a high school, or the college newspaper under our department since the 1970s, okay? It's been free, it's been independent, it's been somewhere else. We're still catching flack every time from the public because their perception is that we publish that newspaper. And I would guess that's the problem with the administrators, is that they're getting feedback. I mean, we don't publish the paper, folks. We haven't published it for, 40 years, but the public still thinks we do.
Well, and you know, the fascinating thing is, and Carrie just made this argument last weekend very compellingly, is that, people seem to grasp or understand that you're not responsible for the plays called on the football field, They don't seem to feel like, oh, you need to pull the quarterback, or kick him out of school or suspend him from the team because he made a bad choice, in this learning activity. So, Don, and then, yeah.
Are we kind of ready for the wrap-up? Because I know you're.
Yeah, well, this is really what this
Okay.
is, and I have some questions that I want to raise. Yeah, yeah.
I don't want to speak out of turn, but I think, because you want to know where to go from here.
Yeah,
And what I keep thinking is probably everyone feels like I do, that there are so many more things I would have liked to say, but
Yeah.
because of time and
Sure.
the number of people,